The Premier League is reportedly discussing and about to approve a potential rule change around salary caps that could impact the summer transfer plans of all Premier League clubs, forcing some to sell players or change plans for those that are going to be acquired. Last week, the Premier League met with shareholders, being the clubs, at its annual general meeting. Several matters were discussed, and one that's made the headlines over the weekend is the potential rule change regarding wages. The Premier League, being the most dominant league in Europe, is renowned for spending more money on transfers and wages as a whole than the rest of Europe. Last year, the Premier League spent £1.8 billion on international transfers, dwarfing that of second-place Italian clubs at around about £500 million. In recent times, English teams have dominated the transfer market, importing talent into the English game in exchange for that cash outflow. Obviously linked to talent acquisition is salaries, and the wages, which are relatively attractive across the whole of the Premier League, are intrinsically linked to those transfers. But part of the attractiveness of the Premier League is that competitive balance, which allows an evenly distributed broadcast model to be used to invest in the squad and have potentially any club compete for European competitions, or, as we've seen with Leicester, even win the league. So why is the Premier League looking to limit salaries? What would the impact be on players and other stakeholders? How will clubs react? And how will the league push this change through? And what other factors should be considered when looking at such a change? My name's Neil Wood and I'm a football finance professional. This channel, Football Finance Professionals, looks to educate you about finance using the medium of football. So whether you're looking to learn about football finance in particular, or whether you just want to learn about finance topics using football as a medium, why not subscribe? If you like the video, hit like, share with your friends, and leave any comments on the topic of wage caps in the Premier League or even the broad football environment in the comments below. Last week, Premier League clubs met with the league itself at its annual general meeting to discuss several matters. This is a normal meeting which happens each year, but it's been reported this year that a topic of conversation amongst many others is that of a potential hard salary cap. What's the difference between a soft and a hard cap? A hard cap will be a fixed amount, or at least set each year, or a soft cap is one that's generally linked to revenues, making them more sustainable for clubs, but allowing clubs to spend more if they earn more. It's been reported that this cap in particular from the Premier League is suggested to be anchored, and that's the terminology that's being used, to the bottom club's Premier League broadcasting revenue. If we look at that last year, that would have been Southampton at just over £100 million. That's not the end of the calculation. £100 million won't be the cap, but a multiple will be applied according to reports. And that multiple at present is suggested to be 4 times that of the figure that I've just quoted. The Premier League broadcasting money for that bottom club. So we'd be looking at just over £400 million in that particular example to give a hard cap on salaries. It's too early to say what transitional provisions would be put in place by the league, but such a significant change would need time to embed into the system, unless the cap was sufficiently high to ensure that no clubs breached it in its first year. But football as a business isn't something that you can make decisions on today and just impacts the financial results for 1 year. Salaries, contingent fees for transfers, and even transfers themselves and the fees associated to them are often paid over multiple years. And planning can be somewhat of a headache because budgeting is intrinsically linked to football performance. So clubs have to estimate where they'll finish in the league and in each competition in which they compete to be able to understand how much they can spend each year and potentially even beyond that when it comes to acquiring talent in the transfer window. And the summer transfer window is now open, so clubs will be considering all of their business until the end of that transfer window. This rule could potentially change a club's plans. So they'll be keen to see a resolution, whether it's voted in or not. If approved, it's likely that the rules will form part of the 23-24 Premier League Handbook, the book that sets out all the Premier League rules from broadcasting requirements, ticketing, hospitality, squad requirements, and that of finances, both on the club side and the league side. But why is the Premier League looking to make such a rule change and introduce a hard salary cap? Does it not already have rules in place that would take care of this? Well, the answer to that is no. Otherwise, they would not be considering such a change. Rule changes such as this that restrict clubs' ability to spend or break even, make profits, or restrict the amount of losses that can be made by a club are done generally for one of two reasons. Number one, to promote sustainability in the environment in which the rules are being set. This environment being the Premier League alone. And it's good to understand that the only clubs that are impacted by the Premier League rules are the 20 members plus the additional members that receive parachute payments. And obviously we have interaction with the EFL, with Premier League clubs being relegated and EFL clubs being promoted each year. So that membership does change. And it will be up to today's members, the 20 clubs in the Premier League, to make a decision on this particular change. The second reason for making a change to these types of rules is around competitive balance. Usually you have sustainability or competitive balance being the driving force for these types of rules. And it's very difficult to implement one without impacting the other. So let's say, for example, clubs were told that they had to break even. And the reason behind that is that the league wanted a competitive competition, restricting the amount of investment, and that clubs had to live by their own means. The byproduct of that is that clubs would eventually become more sustainable. Being restricted on how much they can spend because they have to truly break even would mean that clubs are less likely to get into insolvency-related issues. And this could improve the sustainability of clubs and the overall football environment. The current rules which govern this in the Premier League are called profitability and sustainability, which encourage clubs to broadly spend what they earn, with limits put in place when it comes to the amounts of losses that can be made. The allowable losses can be increased with investment from shareholders, and the rules state that on average over a 3-year period, clubs can lose up to £35 million a year. That is subject to investment or what's called secure funding in the Premier League rules. And that's broadly, in simplistic terms, equity investment into the club. This means that the losses that are made by the club are effectively underwritten by the shareholder. But this doesn't appear to be enough, otherwise wage cap discussions would not be on the table. And a wage cap would likely to be in addition to the existing rules, but we'll have to wait and see what's proposed from the annual general meeting once it's been agreed. And the reason why we say this is because the rules as they currently stand promote spending in certain areas, and that includes infrastructure, in youth development and in the women's game. So it's unlikely that the Premier League would want to restrict that and just have a wage cap in place. Solely restricting costs when it comes to wages is likely to be seen as a restriction of investment, and one that is likely to promote competitive balance throughout the league so that a handful or maybe 1 or 2 clubs do not outspend the rest of the league. Putting a hard cap on a specific figure within the profit and loss account will have this impact, albeit clubs may find ways, depending on how the rules are written, and we don't yet know how they are written, to remunerate players in different ways. And we'll go into that later in the video, so stay tuned. The impact that it would do if it restricts the largest cost base of any football club, being the wages, is that it could potentially increase the profitability of clubs, because the revenues that will be increasing into the future would end up not being able to be spent on player wages. We don't know yet how it's going to impact transfer fees in the Premier League proposal, which would in turn end up in the profit and loss account as amortization. But it's likely that if a number was restricted, it could end up in more profits being generated. And this proposal comes at a time when Manchester City have just completed a European treble, including winning the Premier League, FA Cup and the UEFA Champions League, had 3 back-to-back Premier Leagues, and potentially could go on to win an unprecedented 4th Premier League next season. and have won 5 out of the last 6 Premier League titles. So is it now time to have the discussion to prevent Manchester City from investing even further into their squad, restricting wages, and potentially going on a period of dominance for the rest of the decade, if not beyond that? And that may be what the Premier League is worried about. 1 or maybe 2 particular clubs dominating the league and detracting from that value of it being a relatively balanced, competitive field where many clubs can break into Europe, and there is this continual jeopardy, which makes it a great spectacle to watch. That being said, Manchester City is not the highest spender on wages at present. That would be Manchester United. And given Chelsea's recent spending spree, it could be that they top the table next season. Having said that, it's really difficult to compare given the restricted nature of the disclosures in football clubs' financial statements and the impact of performance-related bonuses. For example, Manchester City's wage bill will be astronomical this year because they've won everything that it would be possible to win with the exception of the League Cup, whereas other clubs obviously have been unable to do that. So we're not comparing like with like. Recently, there have been talks of hard caps being set across the whole of Europe. And it's something that we've mentioned before on this channel. Having consistency across European football, both at the UEFA level and the domestic leagues that sit underneath that umbrella. It's a really difficult one to be able to manage because you've got so many different stakeholders with differing views on these topics. And getting everyone to agree at the same time with their own self-interest is going to be quite difficult, but it has been discussed. As much as Manchester City were in competition with Inter Milan, Real Madrid and Bayern Munich on the run to that Champions League final win, plus many other European teams, the Premier League as its own entity is also in competition with Serie A, La Liga and the Bundesliga. So you could see how different products on different leagues could potentially look to promote their own self-interest or their own product, particularly on that global scale. And with everybody having a similar or the same set of rules, then that would provide a competitive balance across different leagues in Europe. But is that something that the Premier League would be interested in, given its attractiveness to overseas talent and overseas players, partially with the ability to provide the means to the clubs via its broadcasting income to spend on its wages? Now, the Premier League may be looking at this from the angle that it already has the most competitive product and it can spread its wealth across the league, meaning that the lowest placed club is already going to be able to outbid any other European team, even with this restriction, because of the multiple and the fact that the broadcasting rights that they will receive will be significantly more than the vast majority across Europe. But this isn't the first time that the Premier League has looked at some sort of cost control measure. Previously, we had short-term cost control, which was a mechanism linked to the 2012-13 season and any incremental revenue that the clubs have generated on their own thereafter, they could spend on wages. But that was not seen as being relevant anymore, and in the recent past, clubs had decided that that would be removed from the Premier League handbook. But now we see the return of something that is more strict in theory because of this hard nature of the cap. Previously, the short-term cost control would allow clubs that had generated substantial amounts of revenue more than the rest to spend that, and therefore that made the rule redundant. But what would the impact be on players if a hard wage cap was introduced? Obviously, it would restrict the amount that the full squad could earn. How that would be divided up would be up to the clubs. But this could potentially cause some unrest in the dressing room. We'd have to wait and see. Players wouldn't directly get a say in whether this rule was introduced. That would be up to the shareholders, being the directors of each club, to vote on such a rule change. However, in 2021, the PFA, the Professional Footballers Association, successfully challenged a League One and League Two salary cap. So we've already had experience of this type of matter being dealt with by players. It obviously would restrict a player's earning potential. And with a relatively restricted window to earn money, players see this as an issue. The PFA, with the best interests of the players at heart, were able to challenge the proposals made by the EFL to cap League One and League Two salaries based on a hard cap. The reality is that players earn significantly more than the average person on the streets. That would be at the top tiers of European football and even those below it. But in comparison to the majority of people in society, the earnings window is limited. There is a potential for an injury to be career-ending at any point. Although footballers may or may not do it for the money, primarily, and they could do it because they want to play football, it's up to them whether they want to maximise their earnings or not. And any restriction on salaries across the European game will likely be seen as a restriction on the players and be unfair. However, if the whole of European football is agreeing to such a measure, it would be difficult for players to be able to find a viable alternative in Europe, or at least one that would be willing to pay more money. Over the last 20 years, or at least since the introduction of the Premier League in English football, we've seen broadcasting rights and commercial revenue increase exponentially, but also wages have done the same. Clubs now spend a substantial amount of money on player wages, so any restriction that's placed on that figure, with continual increases in commercial income and broadcasting rights, that should theoretically at least mean that clubs become profitable. And that would be the byproduct of this particular change. So one benefactor would be the shareholders, not having to underwrite losses anymore. There would also potentially be a change in the way that clubs pay taxes. At present, the majority of football clubs will pay their taxes through employment-related taxes and VAT, with very few paying corporation tax. However, if they were to become profitable, or at least profitable from a tax perspective, they would start to pay corporation tax in addition to income taxes, employment-related taxes, and VAT. We don't yet know what the restrictions would be around this wage cap. However, clubs may look to remunerate players in a different manner. Recently, we've seen details, or at least we've heard details, of a proposal made to Lionel Messi going to Inter Miami, which didn't include just salary, but it incentivized Messi in numerous different ways, including profit shares from Adidas and Apple, along with the ability to potentially invest in an MLS club in the future. Now that's a topic for another video, so subscribe if you want to learn more about that. However, that could be seen as a way forward for the industry as a whole, and wouldn't be uncommon for other industries to remunerate those that effectively promote the success of their companies or their industries in ways that would be deferred. Share-based payments, for example, often used to remunerate directors or people that are charged with governance. If they were to promote the success of the business, then they could potentially earn more based on that incremental success at a point in time in the future. This isn't an unusual concept, but a difficult one to implement in football, because the football players are not the ones making the decisions to run the club, whereas in other industries that would be the case. Those charged with governance would be making the decisions and would directly be able to drive further value for shareholders. Another huge geopolitical matter that the Premier League and European clubs would need to consider is that of Saudi Arabia. Talent acquisition, transfer fees, and salaries are intrinsically linked to each other. So if European football were to cap wages, with Saudi Arabia at present investing heavily, with Ronaldo and Benzema each reportedly receiving an annual salary of $200 million to play in Saudi Arabia at separate clubs, but on a tax-free basis, versus a restricted earning environment in Europe, in addition to that tax bill that players need to pay at the end of each season, it all of a sudden becomes a hell of a lot more attractive if money was all that matters to the players to go and play in an unrestricted environment, not paying tax. And that presents itself as a threat to European football. And again, a topic for another video. But how will clubs react to this potential rule change? Without knowing how clubs have voted, it's very difficult to predict which ones are going to favour this proposal versus those which would be against it. Some clubs would prefer to make investment decisions based on the backdrop of rules and regulations currently in place, and they could potentially not agree with those rules. But this is a decision for shareholders, and their representatives on the ground will be making the voting decisions. So some may publicly want to look to be able to spend money on wages, but in private could agree to a restriction on wages and point the finger at a larger body or the central body of the Premier League to say, it wasn't us that made the decision. It was the league that forced this through. And ultimately, shareholders could potentially save some money by restricting wages. At present, smaller clubs are unlikely to be impacted if what's being proposed, or at least what's being rumoured, is true. A £400 million wage bill is something for smaller clubs to aim for if that was the intended target. Albeit it's not necessarily that just spending more money on player acquisitions and wages increases your chances of winning more games. There is a correlation, but those decisions need to be smart decisions. And the Premier League as a whole would not want to restrict those smaller clubs because, again, that would impact the competitive balance of the league. And it would also still want to encourage talent acquisition into the league. But what about the bigger clubs? It's often thought that the Big Six control the league, often looking to enforce change across the rest of the league around the rules. Now, we don't necessarily know how this has come about, but it could have been lobbied by certain clubs, or it could have been suggested by the league centrally. Rule changes are enacted through a voting system, and 14 out of the 20 clubs must agree on what's being proposed before the rule is embodied within the handbook. And that means that 7 out of the 20 clubs would have to disagree by abstaining or voting against the proposals to make sure that this didn't happen. So theoretically, that could be the traditional Big Six clubs plus Newcastle. Those 7 clubs could get together to block this change. However, some may be interested in bringing this rule in order to be able to save money. The benefit of this to the clubs is, as we've discussed previously, a potential increase in profits or an ability to invest in different areas. But what other factors should the league, its shareholders and wider stakeholders be considering or be aware of when looking at this type of change? Could a restriction on wages in its purest form divert value to players by other means? That could be through image rights or benefits in kind, such as paying for accommodation, paying for vehicles, cars, housing, or other benefits. For example, allowing players to have a box at each game to host their families, or food, and the list could go on forever. So the league would consider what is defined as wages and whether to include things like image rights or even potentially agent fees in that calculation. The FIFA football agent regulations have also been amended recently to place a cap on agents' earnings. Previously, earnings for players, which would have been used to multiply and calculate the FIFA agents' cap, that was a variable in that equation. But if the Premier League and even the wider European competitions were to introduce a cap on wages for players, that would also cap earnings for the agents. This could potentially force agents to look at alternative ways to be remunerated that aren't linked to being a football agent, but potentially providing holistic services to their clients, being footballers. This is already happening in some areas, and it's a way of diversifying the offer from an agent's perspective. But with football earnings potentially being limited from the agent's perspective, I would imagine that these services would be diversified. The Premier League and the rules would need to consider any performance-related bonuses, signing on fees, loyalty bonuses, deferred payments and contingent payments when it came to calculating this wage cap. Is it just going to be the basic salaries that are going to be capped, and any performance-related amounts after that that are funded by additional revenues would be allowable? Or would it be that the total wage cap for each club, including all bonuses, would need to be capped at specific amounts based on that calculation, presently being talked about as being 4 times the multiple of the lowest club's broadcasting revenue from the Premier League? I'm sure that clubs, the players, the Premier League and all of the representatives and stakeholders within the ecosystem will have considered everything that we've discussed and much more as part of the discussions around whether to or whether not to implement a wage cap in the Premier League. But what are your thoughts on this topic? Leave them in the comments below. Share the video with your friends, and if you like the video, please hit like to support the channel. My name is Neil Wood and I'm a football finance professional. Thanks for watching.